A dusty country road curled into the sleepy town of Grace Hollow, Pennsylvania, as Lillian's rental car crawled past the welcome back sign someone had crudely defaced. The trees lining the roadside stood half naked, their golden leaves carpeting the sidewalks like faded confetti from a celebration no one remembered. Lillian rolled the window halfway down. The air was sharper than she expected. Early November had always carried that brittle scent of wood smoke and wet earth. In her coat pocket, her fingers brushed against the thick envelope still sealed. She passed familiar storefronts, each with hastily taped banners announcing Thanksgiving specials or family gatherings made easy, as if everyone were busy preparing for warm reunions. Dewey's Diner still had the same flickering neon sign and the leaning mailbox that had been crooked since she was 15. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The farmhouse came into view like a ghost summoned from memory, gray clapboard siding, a sagging porch swing, and that stubborn oak tree that refused to die. Inside the house creaked in greeting as she unlocked the door. The hallway smelled of lemon polish and stale thyme. Her old bedroom sat waiting at the top of the stairs, the quilt on the bed, a patchwork of hand-stitched forget-me-nots slightly faded but stubbornly intact. She ran her hand across the windowsill where dust had settled like snow. There in the hallway hung a photo that made her pause. She and Grandpa Howard side by side in front of the barn, her braid crooked and his arm draped around her shoulder. A tightness rose in her throat, unexpected and unwelcome. Lillian unpacked slowly. The room was smaller than she remembered, or maybe her life had just outgrown it. After splashing cold water on her face and muttering something about surviving one night at a time, she headed back out, drawn by the magnetic pull of familiarity. Dewey's Diner looked exactly the same, linoleum floors scuffed from decades of boots and wheelchairs, green booth sagging with memory, and the jukebox still working, hummed a dusty version of Can't Help Falling in Love. Behind the counter stood Don, his back slightly stooped but his smile just as wide.
"Well, I'll be
Lillian Rowe.
Haven't seen you since."
His voice trailed off as he reached for a chipped mug. She offered a tired smile. Since I had braces and attitude. Still got the attitude, he asked, pouring her coffee without waiting for her order. Less than I used to. More than I should. She took a sip and grimaced. Still putting too much sugar in the black coffee. Only for the ones I like, he winked, sliding over a small plate with a ginger snap. Just like old times. Around her, the diner buzzed with quiet conversations, low hums about weather church raffles, and who might be cooking the turkey this year. A few locals looked up, recognition sparking in their eyes, followed by that old familiar flicker, surprise, skepticism, then polite disinterest. She wasn't sure which was worse. Lillian didn't linger. She left a tip out of habit more than the coffee cost and stepped outside, her boots clicking on the pavement. That's when she saw her. Bethany stood in front of the courthouse, perfectly styled in a camel-colored coat, a leather tote slung over one shoulder, and that same clipped posture that screamed control. Her eyes landed on Lillian like spotlights dissecting. "Well," Bethany said, lips curling into a smirk. "Didn't realize thrift stores still sold wool skirts from the 90s. "Hello to you, too," Lillian replied, pulling her coat tighter. Bethany took a step closer, voice low, but sharp. "You know this will reading is just a formality, right? Grandpa's affairs were clean. No surprises. You got your memories and I got the rest. Didn't realize it was a competition." Bethany's gaze narrowed. "It's not. You already lost." Something bitter curled in Lillian's gut, but she didn't rise to the bait. "Not yet." The courthouse bell chimed the hour, its sound too dignified for such pettiness. "Oh," Bethany added with a faux casual air. They moved the will reading up. "You might want to actually check your email for once." Lillian hesitated. Thanks for the heads up. As Bethany turned on her heel, she threw over her shoulder. Dad may have left you a name, but Grandpa left you nothing. Lillian stood rooted, the words carving ice down her spine. The courthouse door closed behind Bethany with a hollow thud. Silence followed, the kind that buzzed in your ears and filled the cracks you didn't know were there. She slipped her hand into her coat pocket, fingers curling around the worn edges of the envelope. Grandpa Howard's handwriting stared up at her, crooked and stubborn. She hadn't read it yet. The scent of apple pie drifted from the church basement, mixing oddly with the faint smell of funeral incense. The crowd had trickled from the sanctuary into the narrow hallway below their black coats, dusted with the cold remnants of autumn. Lillian descended the steps carefully, one hand grazing the rail worn smooth by decades of potlucks and choir rehearsals. Inside the basement of Grace Hollow's First Baptist Church, time seemed preserved in aluminum trays and styrofoam cups. Tables lined the perimeter, covered in floral vinyl cloths, hymnals stacked beside baskets of rolls. A long buffet offered a Midwestern tableau, baked macaroni, limp green bean casserole, meatloaf slices under congealing gravy. A slow-moving line of mourners moved forward, murmuring blessings and banalities in equal measure. Lillian took a paper plate more from instinct than hunger. As she spooned a modest helping of applesauce beside her cold casserole, she caught snippets of conversation. Something about the rain last week. Someone's hip replacement. A cousin's boy who got caught stealing gas. But beneath the small talk, she felt the tug of old judgment, looks too thin, hair too short, too quiet for someone grieving. "Is that Lillian Rowe?" One voice whispered loud enough to echo. She left for the city and came back with, "What a story." Lillian didn't look up. She found a seat near the wall and focused on her lukewarm coffee. Her gaze wandered to a cracked window pane where condensation blurred the leafless branches outside. Across the room, Bethany was in her element. Draped in a sleek gray suit that shimmered under fluorescent light, she stood tall, one hand on the shoulder of the pastor's wife, the other gesturing with casual authority. Her laughter rang clear, punctuated with gentle pats and nods from the town's older women. Sympathy flowed toward her like heat to the sun. Then came the speech. Bethany stepped to the front of the room, dabbing the corner of her eye with a neatly folded tissue. Grandpa Howard was a pillar. She began, her voice smooth as warm honey. He taught us what it meant to stand tall to serve the community. His legacy is woven into the fabric of Grace Hollow, and I intend to honor that. Murmurs of agreement followed. Someone clapped once before thinking better of it. Lillian sipped her coffee, bitterness growing. She stared at the piano in the corner, its keys hidden beneath a frayed lace cover. Next to it sat a plastic plate holding a lonely cube of Jell-O and a napkin with the church's name stamped in faded blue. "Lillian, dear." She turned. Mrs. Moss stood beside her, smelling faintly of lavender and wood polish. Her pearl clip-on earrings bobbed gently as she leaned closer. "I always told your grandfather he had the sharpest granddaughters. He liked to pretend you two were opposites, but I know better." Lillian offered a faint smile. "He never liked things to be simple, Mrs." Moss's eyes twinkled behind wire-rimmed glasses. "He also didn't like waste, which is why I think he left more than what's in that will." Lillian raised an eyebrow. "More I can't say for sure," Mrs. Moss said, lowering her voice. "But the week before he passed, he told me, truth doesn't rot. It just waits under the dust." Strange thing to say, but Howard was full of strange wisdom. Lillian's fingers tightened around her cup. "Did he mention anything about me, Mrs.?" Moss smiled again. "Only that the town never saw you right," as the older woman was called away by a friend in need of a fresh fork. Lillian sat back, staring at the green bean casserole growing colder by the minute. Her mind pulled her to a different time. Rain pounding on the tin roof of the corner grocery, the hiss of tires on wet pavement. Grandpa's arms full of canned beans and bread, only to find he'd left his wallet behind. The awkward silence at the checkout. Without a word, teenage Lillian had stepped forward and paid in crumpled bills. She never mentioned it, and neither did he. But the next week, a warm apple pie had appeared on the farmhouse porch with a note. "Some things don't need saying." She didn't know what to do with the memory now. "Funny you showed up," came a voice at her elbow. Bethany stood beside the piano, her expression too composed to be casual. "Did you think there'd be something for you in the end?" Lillian blinked slowly. "I came to say goodbye." Bethany tilted her head. "Sure. And Grandpa wrote you a letter because sentiment—" Lillian didn't answer. Bethany stepped closer, her voice dropping. "There's nothing left for you here." "Lillian, you don't belong in this story." Then she turned and disappeared into the kitchen with a grace that made Lillian's jaw tighten. She reached into her coat pocket, fingers trembling just slightly. The envelope was still warm from her palm. She broke the seal, unfolded the note. "You've always seen people for who they are. That's why this next part is yours to carry." The courtroom was warmer than expected. Lillian sat in the back row, heart pounding louder than the gavel. The scent of lemon polish mixed with old dust lingered in the air, clinging to the wooden paneling and brass nameplates that hadn't changed since she was a teenager. Outside, the gray sky pressed low against the windows, casting a dim hush over the oak benches and rustling the brittle leaves that skittered down Main Street. Inside, time seemed to hold its breath. Judge Martin adjusted his glasses, his voice calm, almost bored as he opened the folder before him. "The matter of Howard Rowe's estate," he announced, eyes sweeping briefly across the room. Lillian's hands twisted the hem of her coat. The words from Grandpa's note pulsed at the edges of her thoughts. "You've always seen people for who they are." Bethany, seated in the front row, looked carved from marble. Her gray wool coat matched the sleek bun pinned at the nape of her neck. She didn't glance back at Lillian, but her shoulders sat high, proud. At her feet, a designer handbag lay zipped tight, her fingers tapping in sync with the judge's cadence. "The primary estate, including the family home stock portfolio and personal effects," Judge Martin read, "are hereby bequeathed to Bethany Elaine Rowe." Bethany's lips curled in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. A soft murmur rose from a few townsfolk gathered in the back. Lillian remained still, bracing for the moment to pass, for the gavel to fall. But the attorney, a tall, stoic man in a tweed suit who'd been silently observing, stood. "Your Honor," he said, holding up a second envelope. "There remains one final page handwritten by Mr. Rowe." He requested it be read only in the presence of both granddaughters. A beat of silence. Judge Martin took the envelope with care, noting the embossed seal, the initials H.R. etched in fading ink. He cracked it open, smoothing the page beneath his palm. The courtroom seemed to lean forward. "To my granddaughter Lillian," he began. Bethany turned in her seat, her expression unreadable. "You were never loud, never the first to speak, but you were always the first to see. You saw people as they were, not as they appeared. You saw me when I was weak and never turned away." A cough broke the hush, then silence again. "I built something quietly over the years, something I never told many about. A fund, a trust, a promise. It's called the Second Harvest Grace Fund, and it was meant not just to preserve my legacy, but to serve this town long after I'm gone." The judge paused, cleared his throat, then read the closing line. "I am entrusting it to Lillian, whose heart this community needs more than it knows." Gasps broke out, soft but sharp enough to cut through the warmth. Lillian sat frozen. She wasn't sure if she'd breathed since the letter began. Bethany's shoulders dropped just slightly. The color had drained from her face, and for the first time in years, she looked smaller than Lillian remembered. Whispers rippled through the courtroom. A foundation. Howard did. What why her judge? Martin adjusted his glasses again and looked directly at Lillian. His expression, once neutral, now held something gentler. Perhaps surprise, perhaps recognition. "Ms.
Rowe,
he said evenly.
do you accept this responsibility?"
The scent of lemon meringue hit Lillian as she stepped into Grandpa's old study, a room sealed for 5 years. The door creaked open on stiff hinges, and a puff of stale warmth met her cheeks. She stepped in slowly, half expecting a voice to greet her, half afraid of what memories might stir. The study smelled like time folded in on itself. Citrus old paper typewriter ink, and the unmistakable musk of walnut shelves, long left undisturbed. Dust danced lazily in the golden afternoon light, filtering through heavy curtains. A half-eaten slice of lemon pie rested on the desk, slightly dried at the edges. Must have dropped it off earlier when she was out walking the property. Next to it, Grandpa's chipped coffee mug sat where it always had the words, "It's a justice thing," faded, but still legible. Lillian reached for the mug, but paused. She let her fingers rest gently on the rim instead. She recalled Mrs. Moss's words after the funeral. "Your grandfather left more than heirlooms." Back then, it sounded like the kind of wistful poetry older folks used when remembering someone kindly, but now it echoed like a clue. As the floor creaked beneath her, Lillian approached the bookshelf closest to the window. A small brown recipe book sat nestled between outdated encyclopedias. She pulled it out and flipped through the familiar pages until she reached the section on pies. There, tucked inside a note about crust flakiness, was a small iron key cool against her palm. She turned toward the cabinet at the corner, the one always locked, the one Grandpa said was just boring paperwork. The key slid into the lock with a soft click. Inside were 3 leather-bound ledgers, a stack of envelopes, and a single letter marked simply Lillian. She sat at the desk, the pie untouched beside her, and opened the letter. "If they judge you by your suit, show them your shoes. They walk the story." She smiled. It sounded like him, blunt-wise and entirely unexpected. The ledgers were full of names. Some she recognized, families from church people she'd seen at Dewey's Diner, a former teacher who always wore the same cardigan no matter the weather. Notes were scribbled in Grandpa's tight cursive beside each entry. Gave Ruth $300 for a new furnace anonymously. Covered Jimmy Parker's ER bill when insurance denied claim. Helped M. Delaney with first semester law school, never told him. She turned the page. There it was. Mason. A. Delaney. A brief note. Bright. Good heart. Too proud to ask hope. He runs farther than I ever did. Lillian leaned back, heart full and aching. This wasn't just a foundation, it was a life's quiet mission. He had helped people when no one knew. He had stitched the town together behind the scenes. The phone on the desk rang once, then stopped. Her own pulse quickened. On the bulletin board across the room, she noticed a flyer someone had slid under the door earlier that day. Bethany Rowe presents a gala to honor the life and legacy of Howard Rowe. Formal attire required. Lillian scanned the text. Nowhere did it mention the Grace Fund. Not a word about the foundation or the people it had helped. She pressed her lips together. It wasn't just a party. Bethany was trying to reshape the story, polish the image, and sweep the real legacy under the rug. Lillian reached for the old rotary phone and flipped through the ledger again. She found the number scrawled beside Mason's name. She picked up the phone, calling someone from the ledger list, a former scholarship kid, now a respected journalist. The Rowe family table was set for perfection. Polished silver tall candlesticks, but the silence crackled like broken glass. The chandelier overhead gleamed with the effort of recent polishing, its crystal drops catching the flicker of flame from the tapered candles. Outside, a soft snow had begun to powder the hedges, blurring the edges of the stone path that led up to the front porch. Inside, the estate felt tight, like everyone was holding their breath. The roast turkey sat center stage, golden and framed by sprigs of rosemary. Steaming bowls of mashed potatoes and sweet glazed carrots circled it like obedient satellites. Yet no one moved. No one passed the gravy. The air carried the warmth of the fireplace, but none of its comfort. Bethany stood at the head of the table, wine glass in hand, her lipstick an unyielding shade of crimson. She smiled the way a politician might at a camera flash. "To legacy," she said, her voice velvet smooth, earned not given. The clink of crystal was hesitant, the toast half-hearted. Lillian held her glass but didn't lift it. She met her sister's eyes across the table and didn't flinch. Grandpa's chair, the one with the slightly worn armrest where he used to drum his fingers, remained untouched, its cushion puffed and empty. Lillian hadn't planned on saying anything, but the hollow echoes of curated gratitude had started to ache in her chest. She rose slowly, placing her cloth napkin beside her plate. "I'd like to offer a short thanks as well," she said, her voice clear but without fanfare. Not for tradition, not for ceremony, but for the quiet hands that helped without asking for glory. Some forks paused midair, others lowered silently. "I've come to learn," she continued, "that generosity doesn't always wear a suit or carry a surname. Sometimes it just shows up quietly when it's needed most." There was a shifting of weight in seats, a cough covered by a napkin. Just then the front door creaked. Every head turned as Mason Delaney stepped into the room, coat dusted with snowflakes, scarf looped once around his neck. Bethany blinked. "Excuse me. He's my guest," Lillian said gently. Mason offered a polite nod, his expression composed but resolute. He took the empty chair near the end of the table, the seat furthest from Bethany, closest to Grandpa's. "I won't stay long." Mason began resting his palms on the linen. "But I couldn't pass up a chance to share something. In 2002, I was 2 months away from dropping out of law school. I didn't tell anyone. One night, a check appeared in my mailbox. No note, no signature, just an envelope and a number large enough to buy me time." Gasps rustled around the table like wind through dry leaves. "I found out years later." Mason continued, voice steady, that the check came from Howard Rowe. "I tried to thank him once. He just handed me pie and asked how finals were going." Someone laughed short, startled. "I stand here today," Mason concluded, "because one man believed in quiet, unwavering help, and he asked for nothing in return." Silence fell deep and sharp. The flicker of candlelight threw uncertain shadows onto the old family photos on the wall. Bethany's graduation. Grandpa in his Navy uniform, a childhood shot of 2 girls in matching dresses, one always standing slightly behind the other. Bethany pushed her chair back, rising slowly, her knuckles whitened around the stem of her wine glass. "You think you've won, Lillian? It's not over." The air inside. Grace Hollow's town hall felt different, lighter, like something long buried had finally breathed. The wood-paneled walls of the old building, which once seemed tired and yellowed by years of budget meetings and bake sale announcements, now gleamed under soft strings of white Christmas lights. Folding chairs filled the center of the room, and the scent of cinnamon cider from a nearby thermos lingered in the air. Lillian stood near the modest podium, her coat draped neatly over a back chair. Grandpa's dark green scarf looped around her neck. She wasn't sure when her hands had stopped trembling. Maybe it was when Mason had clasped her shoulder earlier and said, "You're exactly where you're supposed to be." The community event wasn't grand. No stage lights or catered hors d'oeuvres, just neighbors, thermoses, paper programs printed two to a page, but somehow it carried the weight of something real. Lillian adjusted the microphone slightly and looked out over the small but steady crowd. Mrs. Moss sat in the front row, her hands folded atop a worn leather purse. Don leaned against the back wall, holding a styrofoam cup and wearing a sweater with a crooked snowman. Mason nodded from near the side aisle beside a teenage girl with bright eyes and a binder full of notes. "I want to thank you all for coming," Lillian began, voice steady. When Grandpa Howard set up the Grace Fund, he didn't do it for recognition. He did it because he believed in second chances in silent kindness. A few heads nodded. Someone dabbed at their eyes. "He kept notes," she added, smiling faintly. Not for pride, but for accountability. He believed stories mattered, that the people behind the numbers deserved to be seen. She shared a few of those stories. A struggling single father who used a grant to keep the heat on through winter. A quiet young artist whose scholarship had bought her first set of paints, names withheld, but hearts remembered. Then one by one others stood. Mrs. Gentry spoke of a rent envelope that had shown up on her doorstep the month her husband passed. The mayor told a story about his brother's medical bills paid off anonymously. The teenage girl stood last, holding a framed photo. "I found this at the school archive," she said, voice soft. "I think it belongs here." She handed the frame to Lillian. Inside was an old photo, Grandpa Howard's smiling, chalkboard in hand, written across it. "One act of kindness changes everything." Lillian blinked fast. She didn't want to cry. Not here. Not yet. When the speeches ended, the mayor approached her quietly. "You know," he said, hands in his coat pockets, "we've had a seat open on the community advisory board. You've got the trust. And frankly, we need someone who understands what service looks like." Lillian gave a slow, grateful nod. "I'd be honored." As the chairs were folded and the crowd drifted toward the cider table, Mason handed her a small sealed envelope. "Found this on the back table," he said. "Has your name?" Grandpa's handwriting again. Her heart skipped. She walked to the corner of the room away from the bustle and opened the seal. Inside one sheet, thick paper, faint scent of pipe smoke and lavender. "Lillian, the house is yours. Not because of blood, but because of belief. Build something from it. Fill it with warmth, not memory. You were always meant to outgrow them. Love, H." She exhaled long and quiet. Outside, snow flurries swept across the sidewalk. The bakery down the street gave away cups of warm cider from a barrel by the door. Don handed her a to-go cup with a wink. "Senior discount. You're a few decades early, but spirit counts." As she stepped out into the cold, her boots crunched softly against the salt-dusted walkway. A soft wind tugged at Grandpa's scarf. Then a voice called her name. She turned. The mail courier approached, holding a single letter. "Dropped off late," he said. "Looks personal." She took it, heart suddenly alert. The handwriting was sharp, practiced Bethany's on the front. "We need to talk. They tried to write me out, but I turned the page and wrote a better story." In the quiet hush after the last chair was folded and the snow began to fall, Grace Hollow no longer felt like the place Lillian had once fled, but a place where truth had taken root. Sometimes the stories we inherit aren't bound in ink or framed on walls, but whispered in the kindness we pass forward when we choose to see others not by where they've been, but by who they've quietly become. We offer something far more lasting than judgment. Kindness, like old quilts and warm cider, has a way of returning just when we need it most. If this story stirred something in you, perhaps it's time to write a quiet page of your own.